Good afternoon, all. Welcome to our today's webinar on responsible gambling tools and which ones are to be considered the most efficient, the most used. This is the fourth webinar broadcast this year by APAJO, the Portuguese trade association for online betting and gambling operators, licensed and regulated in Portugal. Today's roundtable is organized as part of the European Safer Gambling Week, hosted by EGBA. Hence, a particular warm welcome to all our international viewers. Our guests are Sonia Torão, Senior Compliance Manager at Kaizen Gaming, Petano, Portugal. Dr. Mark Griffith, Distinguished Professor of Behavioral Addictions at Nottingham Trent University. Ricardo Viegas, Senior Researcher at Ipsos Portugal, and Ricardo Domingues, Vice President of APAJO. I'm Anne-Marie Fujika and Secretary General of APAJO and today's host. So let's dive into the topic immediately. And I'd like to start with Sonia. Sonia, you've been around in compliance in Portugal since the opening of the market in 2016. You worked for different operators already, and you were able hence to be very close to all the tools foreseen by law. So perhaps you can give us a short introduction in the responsible gambling tools foreseen by Portuguese law and your experience with those tools.
Yes, of course. Good afternoon. At first, let me thank. It's a pleasure to be here today discussing such an important topic like responsible gambling, essentially in Portugal. According to my experience, since 6 years ago until today, this is a topic that has high importance for operators and for our regulator as well, because our regulator is not is very sensitive with this kind of problems regarding protection of customers. And this is a pattern that I have been founding since the beginning in 2016 until today. The only difference that I saw is that our regulator has been improving its controls. So there is zero tolerance about every infringement or every failure that our technical system may have when we are having problems about responsible gambling features. So this is to say that since the moment when an operator wants to apply for a license, it's a requirement and mandatory. No, there isn't any operator in Portugal that can obtain a license without having delivered first a responsible gambling plan. And this responsible gambling needs to have at least the minimum requirements that we see in our law and that we see in our technical regulatory requirements that is the basis of our technical systems. So I will be mentioning the minimum requirements that we need to have today. These mechanisms are not so different from the ones that we are used to see in other jurisdictions. I am speaking about self-exclusion. The self-exclusion that the player can activate in our sites and the player next to Stage as well. So the difference is that in our sites, the player is able to be avoided to place bets and deposits only in the proper site. If the player goes to Stage and activates self-exclusion, this will be applied to all operators in Portugal, at least the ones that are regulated by Stage. We are facing a little difference regarding the minimum time required, because we are applying 3 months as a minimum for a self-exclusion. We know that there are other markets that are not so strict about that. We have, for example, self-exclusions that are during only 7 days. But the fact is that our law is a little more close about this, and 3 months are the minimum time that is required for a player to be self-excluded. As well, we see that the player, when he wants to revoke his self-exclusion, he will need to wait 30 days. This is called the reflection time, the time that the legislator found that was reasonable for the player to think if he really wanted to come back and play again or not. Then in the second phase, we see another option for the player that won't want to be away from his player account during 3 months, and he is able to activate the timeout period. In this case, our regulation is requiring that at least the player must be able to not deposit or place bets during 24 hours. There are some operators that are applying more time than these 24 hours. For instance, today the player is able to activate 24 hours, 1 week, 1 month. And finally, in third place, the player has also the ability to activate some limits in his player account. We don't have in Portugal as a minimum requirement the limits for losses, but we have the limits for bets and the limits for deposits, meaning that the player can apply or daily or weekly or monthly limits according to his wish. And these are the main three requirements that our regulation and SERIJ is monitoring on a daily basis. And why? Because we need to consider that we are not only applying the regulation, meaning that not only our technical systems are complying with the regulation, but also we are being monitored on a daily basis by SERIJ. This means that SERIJ knows that all the time which players do we have playing with us, which players do we have as self-excluded, which players do we have with a timeout activated. And even in the end of each month, we are required to send a global and monthly report with the total number of accounts that we have self-excluded, the ones that we reactivated, and the ones that we canceled. So I can tell you, according to my experience, that we have a very supervisory regulator on these topics. The only thing, and it's my opinion, that I find here regarding responsible gaming is that our law is tending too much for the self or the auto action by the player, meaning that operators don't have too much freedom to act when they find some addiction problems. And this is, in my opinion, one limitation that we have currently in our law. Despite there are some operators that are applying other actions and doing more than what is required by regulation. What I can tell you is that the minimum requirements are good. They are working. We are seeing today that the limits, at least the increase of the limits, is a feature that is often used by our players. Self-exclusion, we can look to self-exclusion in a different perspective, meaning that maybe the self-exclusion that is activated next to SERIJ is the real self-exclusion, because the pattern that we are facing in Portugal is that we have the players that use to activate self-exclusion are always the same. So we are speaking here about addition problems that requires maybe some more actions on operator side than the mechanism that we have today only on player side.
Thank you, Sonia. Mark, now you have done research on gambling behavior for many, many years. As Sonia mentioned, there is a strong focus on self-responsibility on behalf of the customers. What does research say in regard to those tools where customers have to actively push a button and say, here, I want to restrict myself? What does research say here in this regard? And do you see it as negatively as Sonia, or would you say it's extremely important that the customer is involved?
Okay, there's a lot of things to unpack here. I mean, I've been working in problem gambling for 34 years now, and it's only more recently, particularly in the last 8 years, that I've now been working with gambling operators and actually looking at their real gambling data. So a lot of the evaluation of responsible gambling tools, I've looked at real gamblers in real time on real gambling sites. So I think so far, as of today, I've published 26 studies that have used behavioral tracking data, and 13 of those have specifically looked at evaluating the efficacy and the effectiveness of responsible gambling tools. So in a nutshell, what those have tended to show us, so we've done 5 studies evaluating limit setting, okay, and all of our studies tend to suggest that limit setting is a very effective responsible gambling tool. Interestingly, we did a study, for instance, on 175,000 players on the Kindred website, and we found that those people who voluntarily set limits were actually far more loyal to the gambling operator and would still be with the gambling operator a year later. We also did another study with Kindred looking at limit setting over the long term, and we found that people again who set people who voluntarily set their limits over a year period, they significantly reduced the amount of time and money that they'd spent on the Kindred gambling site. We also did another study where we looked at different types of gambling, and we found, for instance, this was a study where we had 100,000 online gamblers and then looked at a subsample of 5,000 online gamblers who had voluntarily changed their limits in some way over time. And what we found was that for casino players and lottery players, having a monetary limit setting facility was the most useful thing for them. But for poker players, it was actually setting the amount of time that they wanted to spend on the platform was actually the most useful. But what has come through very, very consistently in our studies is that limit setting is something that is very effective. I've also been doing a lot of work in Norway with Norsk Tipping, and they are one of the few countries, they have what's called a global loss limit. So you can't actually lose more than 20,000 kroner a month, which is around about 2,000 euros a month. And if you want to play on Norsk Tipping products, you have to it's mandatory that you set your limits on their site. They also have something called a player card. So this player card is not only used in an online environment, it's also used. So every time a person goes into a shop and even buys a lottery ticket, or they go into an arcade or a shop and they play on a video lottery terminal, they have to use their player card. And so what we've got now, of course, is the totality of their complete gambling behavior, not just online, but also offline as well. And of course, this is a very rich data set that we as researchers can start to look at, because we can start to do interesting things that look at things like how much do people gamble when they're in an environment where they serve alcohol. So for instance, if you've got a player card, we know if you're in a bar that serves alcohol versus maybe a shop or a convenience store where you're not actually drinking alcohol at the same time, for instance. So on the limit setting side, that seems to work. We've also done 3 studies looking at what we call personalized messaging. So for instance, I've developed a behavioral tracking tool with somebody called Dr. Michael Auer, who works with a data mining company in Austria. And this behavioral tracking tool, this can actually follow people online. It can actually work out risky behavior. It can identify what the tool thinks are potential problem gamblers, and actually send them personalized messages at specific times based on when they significantly change their behavior. So things like if they're suddenly playing for significantly longer amounts of time, they're depositing significantly more money than usual, they're betting more money than usual. I mean, these things, you know, and in our 3 personalized messaging studies with a more kind of interactive element to this, is that we found that personalized messaging does seem to be very effective in getting people to reduce the amount of time and money that they spend gambling. We've done 2 studies evaluating pop-up messages. So for instance, now lots of responsible gambling operators will have pop-up messages that come up on the screen telling the gamblers to do something or recommending to do something. Now there's actually been, as far as I know, there's been 18 studies published in the literature evaluating the efficacy and the effectiveness of pop-up messages. Nearly all of those, 15 of those 18 studies, have been done in a laboratory situation. And in that laboratory situation, the biggest sample size was just 219 people. Now, all 15 of those studies have tended to suggest that pop-up messages are an effective way of doing things like getting people to stop while they're gambling if they've been gambling for a long time. But we did 2 studies, one with 50,000 online gamblers and another one with 70,000 online gamblers. And actually what we found was less than 1% of gamblers actually will stop their gambling when they've been playing for a long period of time. So it does seem to suggest that pop-up messaging is much less effective than something like personalized message or limit setting. We've done 2 studies looking at what we call mandatory play breaks. So a lot of companies now, when somebody is playing for an hour on their website, is that there is a forced termination. So that might be, for instance, stopping you for 90 seconds, or it might even be stopping you for up to an hour on that particular website. Our research has suggested is that for very short forced terminations, forced mandatory breaks, they're not particularly successful in terms of getting people to slow down their gambling or to spend less money. And that the longer the break is, and I think Sonia mentioned this idea of a kind of reflective timeout, the longer the break that you have, the more effective it is in terms of people coming back onto the site and not wanting to come back onto the site so quickly. Now, in terms of your kind of responsibility, I mean, the kind of tools that we've been evaluating, some of them are there that are set by the player. Some of them are things that the operator is doing and trying to making a proactive approach to actually identify people that are engaging in risky play and to try and and change that player behavior. Sonia mentioned self-exclusion. Okay, now self-exclusion, I mean, I've done quite a bit on self-exclusion, and I think a lot of people in the research field, they actually assume that people who are self-excluders, this is almost admitting that these people are problem gamblers, but in fact, that's not the case at all. A lot of people use very temporary self-exclusion measures, so things like the 24-hour play break, a week play break, or a month play break. These temporary self-exclusions are not used by problem gamblers. They're used by just regular recreational gamblers, and they use it to do very sensible things. So for instance, if I knew I was going out tonight and going to drink a lot of alcohol, then I could actually set a limit to say I don't want to gamble for 24 hours on this website, because I know that when I come in tonight, I'll have had too much to drink, I won't be able to make informed choices, and I'll probably engage in riskier gambling. I know, I'm somebody that gets paid monthly. So towards the end of the month, I've got less money. So I can go onto gambling websites and exclude myself for a week just before my next paycheck. And again, that's nothing to do with problem gambling. That is to do with responsible gambling. And then, of course, we're just about to come up to December now. And this is a popular month when a lot of people just block themselves and give themselves a temporary self-exclusion for a whole month, because they don't want to be spending money in December when they're actually going to be using money to buy things like Christmas presents. So for me, self-exclusion shouldn't be necessarily seen as a proxy for problem gambling. And in fact, we just published a study a couple of weeks ago that looked at self-exclusion on the Kindred website. And what we found there was that, interestingly, is that within 1 day of coming onto being a new customer onto a site, 20% of people were taking a 6-month self-exclusion within 24 hours of joining this website. And in fact, 50% of new joiners were actually taking a 6-month self-exclusion just 1 week after joining the website. And this is quite clearly nothing to do with problem gambling. This is probably more to do with unhappiness in the way that the online gambling site has actually treated you. So in terms of my message here is that from the research that we've done is that it's quite clear that some responsible gambling tools seem to be very effective. And in our case, limit setting and personalized messaging seem to work the best. Mandatory breaks might work if they are longer rather than shorter ones, and pop-up messaging doesn't necessarily seem to work. And our work on self-exclusion suggests that we shouldn't always assume that self-exclusion is to do with problem gambling. Now, the issue that you were talking about, Anne-Marie, in terms of the kind of responsibility aspect, is that when it comes to gambling, is that all stakeholders have to have an active role in terms of player protection and harm minimization. It's quite clear that players have to take some responsibility for their gambling, but I do think it's inherent on gambling operators and policymakers and regulators and legislators is that they have to have good policy, good regulation, and that the gambling operators themselves, because they have access now to huge data sets with click-by-click strokes of every gambler that they've got, they can actually start to intervene and help people that might be developing risky player patterns. So some of our research now, obviously, we're starting to use things like algorithms to try and predict people who might actually become problem gamblers in the future. We can obviously use various types of behavioral tracking data to intervene and, as I say, send direct, targeted, personalized messages to people as and when they're actually engaged in the risky behavior itself. So for me, it isn't just about that everything should be on the player in terms of self-exclusion or self-limits. Is the operators, for instance, I personally would like to see all operators, particularly in an online situation, that it should be mandatory that every player should actually be able to set their own limit. And if you don't set your own limit, then you can't actually play on that website. So again, it's operators having some mandatory infrastructure in place, but then players having to take some responsibility for their play.
Well, you already teased at a point we will still discuss a little bit later, namely those parts where operators will have to become still more active when it comes to early detection of problematic gambling behavior. But overall, I take with me that the Portuguese regulator apparently set up measures which are backed by research. Now, Ricardo, APAJO commissioned last year with Ipsos a survey to find out how those tools are in fact used, how many players use them, whether those tools are broadly known by customers. And a second part of the study was about the impact of advertising on gambling behavior. Can you a little bit explain what the survey, the results look like?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much to the audience, and particularly APAJO, for inviting us in name of Ipsos to present this set of results. Actually, I would kindly ask Ricardo to show up the PowerPoint. Okay, thank you so much. So all in all, and just a very quick methodological note, this was a study that was commissioned in order to assess the issues placed here by Anne-Marie. And so we took a very broad sample for our market with statistical very robust in statistical terms, with high control in terms of population profiles. And these are some of the main insights. The bulk as much more, but we only focus here on some of the key learnings for this session. And so one of the first ones is that although a majority of interviews do recall some online adding, only 12% remember with some details, being that moreover 1/6 of interviews does not or is not aware of any recent communications done by online gambling platforms. So can we ask to skip to the next one? Indeed, the probability of betting, and just to do a quick technical note, this is declared behavior. We know it has advantages but also some challenges, but all in all, the results are quite solid. The probability of betting, online betting, and the declared influence of ad to online games is quite low. Only 12% of inquiries find it very likely to do or to place a future bet, and only 6% declared to be very impact. Ricardo, the next one, please. So, indeed, the awareness of gambling, of gaming tools is quite high. We have more than 60% of our sample to know some type of instrument to control game. You see here on the right hand side this table. You can see here that total awareness of each of these tools is fairly high. Being that on the third column of this table, you also see that most of this, and we are just focusing here on online gamblers, which are more or less from our data 38% of population. We are encompassing several online game profiles, but it's more roughly about 38 to 39%. But you see here that most of them doesn't feel the need to use this set of tools. Being that, and this is quite interesting, in a way, it meets this agenda, and what is already in place by the market is that are the younger targets, the ones 18 to 24, that have a higher awareness of the tools and also a higher usage. So this is a fairly good result in this way, because it shows that the process it's working, at least in this sort of methodology is working right now. The tools are really important. They are important to establish some responsible gaming. They are doing its fair job in order to promote this responsible gaming, and this is very important, because we need in a way to safeguard the most vulnerable populations, and we also need to build up trust in the industry in order for all stakeholders to in a way be responsible, because full-time prohibition does not work. We can see that from the 20s, full-time prohibition does not work. So what we need is to keep up, at least what this data from consumers show is that we need to keep up the good work and going the extra mile in terms of fine-tuning these tools. And Mark and Sonia already pointed out some very interesting ways that consumers may experience in the future in order to refine this set of tools.
So this is extremely interesting that particularly also young players are aware of those tools and also use it to an extent which I find is quite representative for those who might need the tools. Now, as all said, there are still topics to tackle. Ricardo APAJO published last week a kind of add-on code of conduct for responsible gambling. And in this code, there is quite a strong focus on education and also what Mark already stressed, the early identification of at-risk gamblers. What was the reasoning behind going for such a code of conduct?
Thank you, Annie. Maybe before I jump on to answer your question immediately, I'd like to comment on the numbers just shared by Ricardo, which I think feed into what I'm going to be addressing next. It's no surprise that the numbers, that 60% out of the population that got inquired is aware of responsible gambling tools. In Portugal, there's already, as we've seen, I mean, the responsible gambling tools that are in the law, as Sonia discussed, they're already very good. But there is obviously opportunity to improve. The law is a few years old. We're into the 5th year of this regulatory framework. So, I mean, there's always space for improvement. And in that study, I think what we see is actually the work that the operators have been doing beyond what was prescribed in the law. Even though it's not mandatory, operators in Portugal are doing social media campaigns on responsible gambling. They've also done on TV. And just recently this week, I noticed one of our members doing it on printed press. So operators in Portugal are going beyond what is prescribed in the law. So the objective of this new responsible gambling manual was really to go beyond what we thought, beyond what was prescribed in the law. It made sense 5 years back. Now we're much more knowledgeable. The sector has evolved, and we think that we shouldn't stick to what is prescribed in the law. So this responsible gambling manual is just stretching what was prescribed in the law to the extent of what we can do. Marco sharing some great ideas about proactive messaging, timeouts, and or mandatory timeouts. I'm not really sure if we could force mandatory timeouts under the Portuguese legislation today. Maybe Sonia can address that more properly, but the law needs to evolve, and while these changes are not introduced so that we can improve the responsible gambling measures, we felt that as APAJO, that if we took a few more measures, ensuring that the employees of the operators are completely trained in these tools, not only on the responsible gambling tools, but going to the extent of the advertising. Also, the content of the advertising can also be fine-tuned so that it does not target problem gamblers. And also the education, we truly believe that education and prevention campaigns are really important. And finally, early detection. Early detection is something that Mark has suggested. There's already technologies, algorithms that try to identify these problematic behaviors. And hopefully in the future, we're going to be able to use these technologies and the law allowing it. We will use them to detect and to stop proactively these problematic patterns.
And this brings me back to Sonia, because as far as I'm aware, Betano is here already quite active when it comes to early detection and using AI tools to tackle such issues at a very early stage. Could you, Sonia, please give us a little bit an insight of what is done here?
Yes, of course, and it's correct. I can tell you that Kaizen's responsible gambling concern is a philosophy of Kaizen, meaning that it's part of the culture of the company. And we are always trying to do more than what is required by regulation. Meaning that until now, we are having a humanistic approach when we are treating with responsible gambling, and we are associating this humanistic approach to technology. And so we have several tools that we use. At first, we had our BI tool, and now AI system.
Sonia, we have lost you.
Detect them. Can you hear me?
Yes, but we had some freezes.
Hello?
Yes.
Let's
try whether it's...
So,
Go ahead.
As I was saying, we are always combining the humanistic approach and using technology. We used at first our BI tool, and we have developed last year and have tested exhaustively an internal made in-house AI tool that we are using to help our responsible gaming ambassadors, which are the techniques that we are training every year. We are specializing 35 people per year in order to be able to help and to answer and to detect risks of our gamblers when they contact with us. And this AI tool is one more help that we found. What are we doing with this tool? We are mixing data of customers' activity, meaning statistics, and we are working those statistics to obtain some data, and with those data we are classifying, categorizing our players in responsible gambling risk levels. Depending on the risk level that the player is flagged on, we are taking some actions. These actions are taken by our employees, our ambassadors of responsible gambling, the concept as we call them. And we are doing some actions like well-being calls, personalized emails, depending on the detection, and promoting our tools of responsible gambling as well. This has been having very good effects because we are having now we are monitoring our players since the moment one, so it's very good for us. We have a tool that is learning the way, the behavior, the pattern of our players' activity, and we are getting good results with our new tool. That is one more mechanism that we have. Of course, that we have others. We have our BI tool yet. We are receiving in a daily and monthly and weekly basis our BI reports, where we are checking, for example, the top 10 or the top 20 of losers, the top 10 of depositors, the percentage of withdrawals that were cancelled, the percentage of deposits that have failed, the bets per hour, the spins per hour. So we are monitoring these as well. The weekly reports, for example, are more focused on the way as players are treating their limits, if they are buying more relaxing times or not. And depending on the data that we receive from our tools, we are having actions, as I said in the beginning, always humanistic actions by phone calls or personalized messages to our players.
And do you have some figures for us in regard to percentages, how customers react on those personalized messages and mails?
Yes, I can tell you that we are very optimistic because players are accepting very well our proactive actions. We have some reactions on their side. They are answering to us that, okay, I appreciate your concern. Please, I accept your suggestion when we sometimes are suggesting to apply self-exclusion. Or, for example, of course, that we have other players that don't accept so well our recommendations, but we see exactly that we are facing problem gambling, And so we have another solution in this one. We have to request to cities to apply and include in our terms and conditions a specific rule that enables us to suspend the account when we have right and certain evidences that the player is having problems with gambling. And so we are applying this rule when we detect that in fact there is a real problem with gambling. But I can tell you that as a whole in global, our players are accepting and they are very glad about our approach, meaning that I can tell you that the first communication that we sent to our players just after the registration is a welcome message and an informative email about our tools, our responsible gaming policy, and so on. So, and we believe that we are having the correct approach. We are doing what we feel that is expected from us. And in fact, we have a specific and specialized department inside compliance team. We have a team only focused on responsible gambling features, and is always investigating and trying to find, and their work is only training and training ambassadors, training newcomers to the company, testing the AI tool, working side by side with tech team and checking new data from BI reports. So we have a team that has a very active role in order to mitigate the limitation that we face, at least in Portugal today, about the responsibility of activating the features, the mechanisms of responsible gaming are almost on the player's side and not in our side. That's why we want to prevent, and before we have a problem gambling, we want to prevent the player and help him or teach him how to use, which tools does he have to use, and so on. And I can tell that results are
very promising, Sonia, and I think you comply already with our new code of conduct. That's very good. Thank you, Sonia. I just want to switch a little bit to topic. It's also part of responsible gambling, namely responsible advertising. And we've seen across all Europe tougher restrictions here. And also in Portugal, we still do not have a change in the advertising code. The regulator last year published a kind of soft law, which led to a not obligatory, but nonetheless watershed of advertising on TV and radio last year. Ricardo, from the study we commissioned last year, which we also commissioned to see how those measures show impact, we've seen that for the broader public, they didn't really perceive a change or a reduction in advertising. How do you explain this?
Well, I think that, well, first, I think that this was the right approach to create a soft law and not a hard law, because I think it's important that we progress slowly, make changes, and see what is actually working. One of the reasons why I think that the watershed didn't really produce the desired results is that it's a unilateral mechanism, right? So it just forced the operators to advertise within a specific set of hours. But there was no measure, for example, to limit the amount that is invested. So what we actually witnessed was some operators did reduce a little bit of their advertising, but others kept it the same and just shifted the advertising to a much narrow time slot instead of spreading it throughout the day. So this measure actually could have generated a perception that it's actually more advertising than before, because the investment was concentrated in a smaller time period throughout the day. So it is my opinion that these changes need to be made progressively. They should be done, taking account experts. We've seen that other countries, Italy comes to mind, for example, they had a complete ban on gambling advertising, and now they're considering switching it back on again. So, I mean, it seems that definitely banning it altogether is not the answer. We need to find a balance. And I think we also need more research. We've seen in these studies that we conducted that there's quite a small amount of people that say that advertising persuades them to gamble at all, right? So I think that the way forward is to eventually have a mix of measures, maybe reducing the number of operators that can advertise during a specific slot. If we are talking about online advertising, I mean, most online advertising can be targeted to specific age demographics, so it doesn't make a lot of sense of some jurisdictions that are applying watershed or time limits on the online advertising. It's really, I mean, that's a measure that would be applied on TV, and even on TV, I'm not sure it makes that much sense.
Well, that is the general question. I would also agree with what you say, because is advertising really a reason of increased pathological behavior? Mark, is there any research that shows here a correlation between addiction and advertising, or problematic gambling and advertising?
My reading of the literature, and I've actually done quite a lot on advertising and gambling over the last 5 or 6 years, the straight answer I would go, no, there's not an association. Okay, now the reason I say that is that, kind of 99% of all the research that's done on the effect of gambling advertising is either self-report studies asking people, does seeing an advert make you more likely to gamble? How many adverts do you think you've seen on gambling in the last whatever time period? I mean, they're basically all attitudinal stuff, or it's looking at doing content analyses of the actual gambling adverts themselves, which actually don't help you answer that question at all in terms of, is there a relationship between problem gambling and advertising? Now, if I take the UK, now in the UK, we have had approximately a 600% increase in gambling advertising over the last 2 decades. Okay. Now, in terms of what's happened to problem gambling during that time, is that it's actually been almost constant. It's been around about 0.5% of problem gambling since the year 2000 up to the year 2020. So in that 20-year period, we have not seen any significant increase in problem gambling whatsoever, even though, as I say, there's been a 600% increase in gambling advertising. Of course, also advertising is happening on lots of different media now, including social media as well. I think what's very clear that comes through in the data, and we published a study back in 2015, I think at the time, and it probably still is, the world's biggest attitudinal survey on advertising, and this was on to an almost nationally representative sample in Norway of over 6,000 adults. What we found there is that advertising, if it does have an effect, it particularly has an effect on those that are already problem gamblers. So those that are already problem gamblers, they have a high awareness of advertising. They have more involvement, they say, because of advertising, and they say it has more impact on their gambling. So it's a bit like the internet in a way, in the sense that if you're a problem gambler, the internet, because of its 24/7 accessibility, is actually a risk factor if you're already a problem gambler. And actually gambling advertising, because problem gamblers, you know, in terms of how their brain is working, how their brain fires up when they see gambling related images, and those urges and cravings that they get when they see a gambling advert on television or on social media or in the print media or whatever. It's though, you know, problem gamblers do consistently report is that, you know, they weren't thinking about gambling. They see a gambling advert and then suddenly there's this real trigger, a real urge and a craving to want to gamble. So in that sense, in terms of banning, let's say if you banned advertising, then that would probably be quite a good thing for problem gamblers, because they wouldn't be seeing so many images, so many triggers that led them to do that. But in terms of the general recreational gambler, or those who don't really gamble in the first place, it does seem to be the case that advertising doesn't necessarily, or doesn't really seem to have much of an effect on those particular players. And in fact, on those particular people. But I think gambling advertising is a bit like how cigarette advertising used to be, in the sense that cigarette advertisers used to say that we're not necessarily trying to bring in new people to smoke. We're trying to get people to switch from one brand to another. And I think that goes on a lot in terms of particularly what I'd call the hardcore gamblers, who, you know, those that don't necessarily have problems, but they gamble most days, day in, day out. And that is what the advertising is trying to do, is to try and get gamblers who are gambling with one company to come over and gamble with another company. And the biggest shift that I've noticed in the last 5 years in terms of gambling advertising is there's been a really huge shift towards sports betting, and one particular type of sports betting, which is in-play betting. You know, now that we've got all these new technologies that can hopefully identify problem gamblers, it's actually these new technologies that are being used to actually change the fundamental mechanics of gambling. And when you change the fundamental mechanics of gambling, like sports betting, I mean, 10 years ago, people basically made a bet on whether somebody was going to win a football match or who was going to win a particular race. It was a very discontinuous form of gambling. But of course, now with in-play sports betting, with having 60 or 70 different markets that people can gamble on, and you're gambling on what the halftime score is, how many red cards, how many yellow cards. The point is that those types of things are now being advertised a lot. I mean, we've published, I think, 6 or 7 studies that have looked at the change in advertising and the types of advertising and the content of advertising. We've particularly done it in England and Spain, looking at a comparison between these two countries. And what's quite clear is there has been a real displacement in terms of the types of gambling advertising that is seen. Obviously, there is always some traditional advertising that has been there for a long time in terms of things like national lotteries. I mean, national lotteries, on the whole are fairly popular, but they tend to be games that have very little association with problem gambling. So it doesn't seem to matter how much lottery advertising is out there. It doesn't have any real effect in terms of problem gambling, mainly because the games that lotteries are advertising are those basically low risk to discontinuous forms of activity that usually have very low event frequencies that have a low association with problem gambling. So, the question you asked me at the start, is there an association between problem gambling and advertising? Well, my answer would be, in general, no, mainly because the types of studies that are done can't categorically show there is a definite relationship between the amount of advertising that is out there and problem gambling.
But it was very interesting also the study you mentioned in regard to Norway. And I think, and we all agree, surveys are not totally accurate, and studies based on real data are extremely important. Ricardo, in regards to studies in this field, I think Portugal still needs to catch up. Are you aware of any studies going on right now, or of studies in the past which more or less analyzed closer these kind of topics?
Okay, thank you. Very interesting intervention from all speakers. And regarding your question, to my knowledge, there are some works probably done by public agencies, such as Serviço de Intervenção nos Comportamentos Aditivos e nas Dependências, in their statistical bulletin from 2019 dedicated to gambling and internet. There is also some interesting academic research being conducted. The 2018 study conducted by Filipa, Joana, and Mark hereby gauging cross-cultural differences between English and Portugal youth, analyzing in parallel the link between attachment and youth problem gambling, resorting to constructs such as sensation seeking. It is a milestone in researching this domain in our landscape. In addition, I'm also aware that there are two projects from the Foundation for Science and Technology, Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, FCT, which have received at least partially in one case public funding. One is from 2018, online gambling addiction detection that uses data science and artificial intelligence, and a very recent one submitted by the Faculdade de Direito of University of Porto in partnership with a Portuguese startup company dedicated to audience neuromarketing and market research called MindProber. They have submitted this project called Analyzing the Interplay Between Emotion and Decision Making to Tackle Pathological Gambling. Yet, I feel, in light of this, we are still lacking more work in this field, conducted either by public agencies, academia, or in close link with private sector. Given the excellence currently sprouting on each of these branches in the Portuguese context, I am fully agnostic on the sort of partnership being established. Integrated multidisciplinary research aiming at dimensioning the problem, but also underlying the causal mechanisms would be paramount, especially considering the existing literature that already points to the need of safeguarding vulnerable targets that present impairment or are still biologically developing executive control functions, as well as emotional processing. I come from a PhD that studies decision-making analysis, so this topic is very dear to me, and in a way which strongly impact on one's judgment and decision-making. Such efforts would be most welcome indeed to properly shed light on the matters at hand and help the different stakeholders to make informed decisions. In a way, I think it was Keynes that sometimes said that for collective problems, collective measures. So all stakeholders should be in place out here.
That is very interesting what you say also about emotional decision making, and I take from everything you brought forward today that to some extent, or perhaps not only to some extent, technology, scientific research, new technologies in particular drive the ways how we protect customers. If we jump into the future, let's say 5 years in the future, how would you want responsible gambling to look like, or how do you see responsible gambling look like by then, Mark?
I mean, how I would want it to look and how other people might want it to look are obviously different things. And one thing I've stressed to gambling companies is that simplicity shouldn't be the kind of goal here. Is that, you know, I know that so I'll give an example. In Norway, for instance, when you look at limit setting, is that there are different types of limit setting for different types of activities. So, you know, if you want to gamble on slot machines, there is a different limit set for if you want to gamble online, and there's a different limit set to if you buy a lottery ticket. And then this is all protected by a global loss limit anyway. And, you know, the Norsk Tipping, the Norwegian operator, are saying, you know, there's just too many rules now. You know, people just don't know what all the limits are for all the different things. And I've just said to them, well, you can't just sacrifice player protection and harm minimization for the sake of simplicity. So for me, I think the more that responsible gambling tools become normalized, the more people will just accept it as part of their day-to-day lives. And I mean, I'm glad to see the figures you were presenting today, that there was a high awareness of responsible gambling tools amongst the Portuguese public. I mean, that's one good thing, because I'm sure if you'd have done that 10 years ago, you wouldn't be getting the figures that you are now. So it's quite clear that gambling operators or regulators or wherever is getting the message out there, is that responsible gambling tools are here and they're here to stay. In terms of what they may look like, I mean, what I think is that we're now going over to, if you like, to more automated systems, more proactive systems that are doing even without human intervention. And the more that you start to do those things and happen in an automated way, the more I think, you know, that is going to be something that just becomes, you know, people, I think what's going to happen in terms of the kind of more automated systems is that we'll start to nudge players to do things in a way that the gambling companies want them to do in a safer and more responsible way. And that can be done without necessarily the players even realizing they're being pushed to do those kind of things.
Ricardo, you agree?
Yes, I think that, generally speaking, what we'd like is to see zero business generated from problem gambling, right? We've seen that, the Portuguese regulation and the tools that we have available are in the right direction. They need to evolve. Legislation needs to change. The operators need to implement different tools. I think in general, we're slightly ahead of the curve. The operators in Portugal have been proactive in going beyond what is prescribed in the law. And I think if we continue on this path, and like Ricardo Viegas mentioned, this is a collective effort. The regulator and other agencies, if we collaborate, I'm pretty sure they're using the technologies that are becoming available today, that we can work on identifying, early detecting problem gambling or problematic gambling behavior. As Mark was saying, there's people who are just players that are jumping from one operator to the other, and this also applies to problem gamblers. So if we can block them, and eventually people that start to develop problematic behaviors, if we can detect them early enough and block them from accessing the regulated operators, I think we're on the way to eradicating or to really minimizing what is problem gambling.
So overall, a goal, we don't have any problem gamblers anymore within 5 years.
Not having any at all, I think, might be a little bit ambitious, because our aim is really to have zero percentage coming from problem gambling. We also like to have zero accidents. We also like to have zero deaths. But due to diseases and alcohol or this or that, but it's not really achievable. That should be the aim. And if we reduce that to a bare minimum, if we can identify the majority of these users, and especially the ones that really have problematic behaviors, which are a small part, but still a very important part that we should help, because they do have issues. It's important that we detect those so that we don't impose restrictions on the large majority of the players who don't have problematic behaviors. So we shouldn't be implementing rules that try to fix an issue that a small percentage of the players have, because we don't have the right measures in place. So I think we need to tackle these measures. Some of the suggestions that have already been presented here, pop-ups, forced timeouts, trying to understand the emotions of the player and trying to break the cycles, these negative cycles, this negative flow that the player gets into. And if we are able to successfully disrupt that, and at the limit just suspend the account, I think we're going to be much closer to eradicating problem gambling.
We are already over time, 5 minutes. So I thank you all for this very interesting, constructive discussion. To wrap it up, I feel we are on the right path, but we should and might have to become quicker in light of a very quick developing technological path due to new technologies, G5, AI, mixed reality, so that we do not always be 1-2 steps behind what is already happening. Thank you all again. Have a good evening, and we see us next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so
Bye-bye.
much.